before he was Djarin, before he was Joel Miller, before the internet crowned him daddy, and Hollywood handed him the keys to 3 of its biggest franchises at once. Pedro Pascal was a 5-year-old boy on a plane, leaving his home country in the middle of the night, not knowing if he'd ever go back. His family wasn't fleeing poverty, they were fleeing a dictatorship. And what happened to his parents before that flight, what they risked, what they lost, is the reason Pedro Pascal approaches every single role like it might be his last chance. Stay with me, because this isn't just a Hollywood success story. This is a story about survival first, stardom second. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why millions of people don't just watch Pedro Pascal. They trust him, a name born in crisis. José Pedro Pascal was born on April 2nd, 1975, in Santiago, Chile. But here's what most fans don't know. The timing of his birth wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was a country in the grip of terror. Chile, in 1975, was under the brutal rule of General Augusto Pinochet, a dictatorship that had seized power just 2 years earlier in a violent military coup. Thousands of people were disappearing. Thousands more lived in fear of a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Pedro's parents, Veronica Pascal Dupré, a psychologist, and José Baumeister, a fertility specialist, were known opponents of the regime. That opposition came with a price no family should have to pay. Reports have long described how his parents helped political dissidents escape persecution, quietly, dangerously, at enormous personal risk. This wasn't activism from a safe distance. This was resistance from the inside of a country that punished resistance with disappearance. So when Pedro was still a young child, his parents made an impossible choice: leave everything behind or risk everything by staying. They fled, first to Denmark, seeking asylum far from Pinochet's reach, then, eventually, to the United States, where they tried to rebuild a life from almost nothing. He arrived in America not as an immigrant chasing the American dream, but as a refugee chasing survival. And that distinction, it shapes everything that comes next. The boy who didn't belong anywhere, growing up between San Antonio, Texas, and later Orange County, California, young Pedro carried something heavier than most kids his age could understand. He wasn't fully American. He wasn't fully Chilean anymore either. He was suspended in between 2 worlds, 2 languages, 2 identities. And in the 1980s, that in-between space was a lonely place for a Latino kid to exist. He has spoken about feeling like an outsider for much of his childhood, always adjusting, always translating himself for rooms that weren't built for him. But there was something else, something that would eventually change the entire course of his life. In 1999, when Pedro was in his mid-20s, his mother Veronica died by suicide. This is not rumor. This is something Pedro has spoken about himself, publicly, with remarkable honesty, describing how her death fractured him, how grief became something he had to learn to carry rather than get over. Losing a parent this way, at that age, right as he was trying to break into one of the most brutal industries on earth. It's the kind of loss that ends careers before they start. For Pedro, it didn't end anything. He has spoken about channeling that pain into his art, because sometimes the stage and the screen are the only places grief has somewhere to go. And that's the moment this story shifts from tragedy to determination. 20 years of almost. Here's a number that will shock. Pedro Pascal didn't become a household name until he was nearly 40 years old. Let that sink in. He trained at the Orange County High School of the Arts, then went on to the prestigious Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, one of the top drama programs in the entire country. He had the training, he had the talent. What he didn't have for almost 2 decades was his moment. For years, Pedro Pascal was the actor you saw but didn't remember. A guest spot on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a 1-episode role on Law and Order, small parts on The X-Files, The Good Wife. Blink and you'd miss him. Year after year, audition after audition, rejection after rejection. Imagine dedicating your 20s and most of your 30s to a dream that keeps almost happening. Imagine watching peers get their breakthrough while you go back to the same tiny apartment, wondering if the industry will ever open its door for you at all. Pedro has openly discussed how brutal those years were. The financial instability, the self-doubt, the quiet fear that this dream simply wasn't meant for him. But he never stopped showing up. And in an industry engineered to make people quit, that alone is remarkable, because everything was about to change in the most explosive way possible. The role that broke him through, and then broke hearts. 2014, HBO's Game of Thrones, Season 4. Pedro Pascal steps into the sandals of Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, charismatic, lethal, impossible to look away from. For the first time in his career, the world actually saw him. And then, in one of the most talked about death scenes in television history, the world watched him die in devastating, unforgettable fashion. Fans were furious. Fans were heartbroken. Social media exploded overnight. But more important, for the first time, millions of strangers remembered his name. After nearly 20 years of invisibility, Pedro Pascal had finally arrived, not through a slow climb, through an explosion. The empire begins. If Oberyn Martell opened the door, what came next kicked it wide open. In 2015, Pedro landed the role of DEA agent Javier Peña in Netflix's Narcos, a gritty, morally complex performance that ran for 3 seasons and proved his breakout wasn't a one-time fluke. Then came 2019, and the role that would redefine his entire career. The Mandalorian. Here's the twist most casual fans don't realize. For most of the show, you never see Pedro Pascal's face. He's hidden behind a helmet, per the character's code, with stunt performers handling many of the physical scenes. And yet somehow, Djarin became one of the most beloved characters in the entire Star Wars universe. Pedro brought warmth, vulnerability, and quiet heroism to a character whose face the audience barely ever saw. Think about that for a second. He built one of Hollywood's most iconic modern performances using nothing but his voice, his posture, and his presence. Then in 2023, lightning struck again with HBO's The Last of Us, where he played Joel Miller, a broken, grief-stricken father figure navigating a post-apocalyptic America. Critics called it one of the greatest performances in television history. Audiences called it something rarer. They called it real. And in 2024, he stepped into the Colosseum itself, playing Roman General Marcus Acacius in Ridley Scott's Gladiator II, proof that Pedro Pascal wasn't just a television star. He had become one of the biggest actors in the entire world. Narcos, Game of Thrones, The Mandalorian, The Last of Us, Gladiator II, 5 franchise, 1 man, 0 signs of slowing down. Why we actually believe him? Here's the question every director, every casting agent, every fan keeps asking. What makes Pedro Pascal different? It's not just talent. Hollywood is full of talented people who never connect with audiences the way he does. It's vulnerability. Watch closely and you'll notice Pedro rarely plays untouchable heroes. He plays broken men trying to hold themselves together. Joel Miller isn't a hero. He's a traumatized father clinging to one last chance at meaning. Djarin isn't a flawless warrior. He's a lonely man wrapped in armor, terrified of connection. Pedro brings his own history of loss into these roles, not by copying his pain onto the screen, but by understanding, on a cellular level, what it feels like to hold grief and keep moving anyway. That's why audiences don't just watch Pedro Pascal, they trust him, the human behind the icon. Now here's where the story gets personal, the parts most documentaries skip. On set, co-stars and crew members have repeatedly described Pedro as one of the kindest, most grounded presences in the industry. Someone who remembers crew members' names, checks in on people having hard days, and treats stardom like a responsibility rather than a reward. He's also fiercely protective of his family. His younger sister, Lux Pascal, is a transgender actress, and Pedro has been one of her most vocal public supporters, using his platform to advocate for LGBTQ+ rights and standing beside her at public events, unafraid of controversy or backlash. And then there's the internet. Somewhere between The Mandalorian and The Last of Us, something strange happened. Pedro Pascal became a meme. The internet started calling him Daddy. Twitter, now X, practically declared him a collective crush. Late-night hosts joked about it. He leaned into it with humor and humility instead of discomfort. It's rare, an actor who becomes an internet sensation almost by accident, simply by being decent and talented at the same time. The trophy case. By his late 40s, Pedro Pascal had quietly built one of the most respected award portfolios in Hollywood. He's a Screen Actors Guild Award winner, recognized alongside his ensemble casts for both The Mandalorian and The Last of Us. He's received Golden Globe and Critics' Choice nominations for his gripping performance as Joel Miller. He's been named one of the most influential entertainers working today by major industry outlets. But ask Pedro what the real milestone is. And he won't mention a trophy. He'll mention still being here, still working, still getting to do what he loves after almost giving up entirely. The private man in a public world. For someone who has become one of the most photographed men in the world, Pedro Pascal has kept something remarkably rare in modern Hollywood: privacy. He rarely discusses his romantic life in interviews. He doesn't perform his personal world for the cameras. What we do know is built on public record: his close, protective bond with his siblings, Lux, Nicolas, and Javiera, his devotion to the memory of his mother, and his deep loyalty to friends and collaborators he's worked with for years. In an era where fame often demands total exposure, Pedro Pascal chose a different path. He gives audiences his craft and keeps his heart for the people who earned it. Changing Hollywood's blueprint, Pedro Pascal's rise isn't just a personal victory, it's a cultural shift. He became proof that a Latino, Chilean-American actor could lead multiple billion-dollar franchises simultaneously, not as a token, but as the beating heart of each story. He became proof that audiences don't need a traditional leading man archetype to fall in love with a character. He gave an entire generation of immigrant kids, refugee families, and late bloomers something they desperately needed: permission to believe their story isn't over just because it started painful. The lesson underneath it all: if you strip away the franchise, the memes, the red carpets, here's what remained: a boy who fled a dictatorship with nothing, a young man who lost his mother in the cruelest way imaginable, an actor who spent almost 20 years being told, not quite, before the world finally said yes. Pedro Pascal's life story isn't really about Hollywood. It's about endurance, about using pain as fuel instead of an excuse, about showing up again and again, long after most people would have walked away. Why his story matters to you. Somewhere right now, someone watching this is in their own version of Pedro's 20 years of almost, stuck, doubting, wondering if their moment will ever come. Pedro Pascal's story is the answer. It came late, hard-earned, soaked in loss, but it came. He didn't just become one of Hollywood's biggest actors. He became proof that your timeline was never broken. It was just building towards something bigger than you could see yet. So if this story moved you the way it moved me to write it, hit that like button, subscribe for more real Hollywood stories that go beyond the headlines, and drop a comment below. Which Pedro Pascal role hit you hardest? Joel Miller, Djarin, Oberyn Martell, or Marcus Acacius? Because his story isn't over, and honestly, neither is yours.